Konnichiwa. Welcome to Chocolate with Ed Garcia. I'm Ed Garcia, and this is delicious chocolate. Chocolate is the best part of the day. We're going to have a simultaneous chew of chocolate. We're going to eat chocolate at the same time. Today, I have pomme de chocolat. I think this is French chocolate. I'm in Japan eating French chocolate. Pomme means apple. Okay, all chocolate is good. We have dark chocolate, white chocolate, chocolate covered cherries, chocolate covered apple. This is very delicious. Mint chocolate, chocolate ice cream, chocolate milk, white chocolate. Yes, white chocolate. Okay, it's all good. Get your chocolate. Here we go. Simultaneous chew. Bring it near your lips. 1, 2, 3. That is really good. Wonderful. Okay. Today is speech number 7, more gold mining. Specifically, more data mining. In speech 6, we talked about 50 applications that we did a lot of research on, and today we're going to do a little bit more research on these applications. Let me introduce the chocolate rules. If you watch the TV show NCIS with Gibbs, Gibbs has rules. Rule number 44, take the women to safety first. Rule number 1, always carry a knife. He has many rules. So I decided that I should also have rules, but let's call them chocolate rules. So I'm going to tell you the rules, and then we'll go through this speech and we'll show how the rules apply, and then I will repeat the rules at the end. First, good titles are good. Second, interviews are bad unless they're late and they have no new features. We will define late later. AFCPs equal 1 hour and no new feature. Number 4, help the examiner to help you. For example, give him a good title, give him a good parts list, explanation of reference characters, that is. Number 5, 216 reduces restrictions. Remember, 2 independent claims or less, 16 total claims or less. Number 6, indefinite is bad. Very bad. And ASM, allowable subject matter, ASM, is good. Number 7, the patent office lies. I might be exaggerating. Maybe they just push the truth a little bit, bend the truth. Maybe they believe things that they want to believe that are not true. But let's just call them lies. Okay, here we go. Okay, more gold mining. Remember our friend here, he's a miner in California during the California Gold Rush, 1849. The people that got to California first, they got all the gold that was on the top, all the gold that was in the streams. The people that got there later, they had to dig further, dig deeper, like this guy. This guy has a short-handled pick. He's digging deep into the dirt. And that's what we're going to do. We're going to dig deep into the data. As I said, we are going to review 50 applications published in 2014. All of them have been allowed or abandoned. Of these, 20% were restricted, 10% had titles that were non-descriptive, 28% were rejected as indefinite in the first office action. Now, I'm going to use colors here. I'm going to use red to indicate bad things, green to indicate good things, and brown to indicate average things, meaning it's an average value for patents. Not necessarily good or bad, but there we go. So red, 28% indefinite, 28% indefinite. I think that's bad. I really don't have a number for the average percentage indefiniteness rejections, but I think this is above average. 21 out of 40 of the interviews occurred before the second office action. That seems normal to me, about half before the second office action and half after the second office action. 68% were allowed, which is about average. The average is 70% right now. 1.9 office actions per application, that's about average, and 2.8 office actions per patent. Again, that's about average. As we discussed, there were 10 out of 50 of these applications were restricted, which is 20%. Now, the Patent Office, slide number 5 in their PowerPoint presentation that I mentioned during the last speech, says the number of claims does not matter regarding restriction. Well, that's just a lie. It matters a lot statistically. Now, the examiner is not allowed to say, I'm restricting because there are too many claims. He is not allowed to say that by the Patent Office. But clearly, when we analyze, the number of claims is a very, very important factor in predicting restriction. In particular, we have the 216 rule. Two independent claims or less and 16 total claims or less reduces the risk of restriction to 10%, which is good. That's green. If you don't follow that rule, then it's 44%, which is red. Okay, bad titles. 5 out of 50, or 10%, of the applications had non-descriptive titles, and the examiner required a new title. Now, one of the reasons I want to talk about this issue is because clearly, when we looked at those titles, most of them were bad. In fact, I think all of them were bad. But the point is that the examiner only identified 10% of them as bad. I call this under-identification. He failed to identify many, many bad titles. So this happens frequently with many, many issues. In medicine, this is called a false negative. Let's consider indefiniteness. 28% of the first office actions, OA1, found indefiniteness, made a rejection for indefiniteness. Now, that's 14 out of 50, or 28%. If we consider the concept, again, of under-identification by the examiner, I believe really the majority of these applications have indefinite claims, which causes many problems. But for now, because it's easy for us to count, let's just count the applications that were rejected by the examiner. And consider, what happens in the future? Can we predict the future if we know that there is a first office action rejection for indefiniteness? And it turns out that we can. We measure, there were 14 applications that had first office action rejections. 7 of those applications were allowed. So that is 7 out of 14, a 50% allowance rate. Okay? That's much less than the average allowance rate of 68%. Okay? About 20% less than 68%. All right? That's a big drop. The point is this. If you get a first office action with a rejection for indefiniteness, this is not easy to fix, okay? In fact, statistically, you're not, well, let me rephrase that. Statistically, it's going to be very hard to solve this problem. This rejection is the kiss of death, okay? It's a very bad thing. It decreases your allowance rate by 20%, okay? That's a huge decrease. So let's consider other predictors from the first office action. There are reasons that I want to be able to predict the future based on the first office action. Good reasons, but I'm not going to get into that right now. But let's consider, number 1, indefiniteness, 7 out of 14 equals 50%. That's very bad. That's a 20% less than the average. Well, what about an interview? Specifically, an applicant-initiated interview, AIIV, pre-second office action. This occurs before the second office action. There were 20 of these, and 14 of them were allowed. That's 70%. So notice I have that one in brown. That's almost exactly 68%. So that's very average. What does that tell us? That tells us that interviews before the second office action apparently have no effect on allowance rate, or only a tiny effect. This is not statistically relevant. It's within the margin of error. Let's continue. What about allowable subject matter in the first office action? For example, claim 11 has allowable subject matter, and the examiner says claim 11 has allowable subject matter. If you put it into independent form, we will allow that claim. Or claim 11 has allowable subject matter, except there's an objection to some other small problem with it. So if you fix it, it's allowable. That's what the examiner is saying. It's allowable subject matter, and I want to allow some claims here. Or perhaps one claim is allowed, but not all of them. So that's what happens here in the first office action. In that case, 90% chance of allowance. 7 out of 8, which is 88%, but let's call it 90% to keep it simple. So look at this. In the first office action, if it's indefinite, you go from about 70% to about 50%. You take a hit of 20%. Or if you have allowable subject matter in the first office action identified by the examiner, then woohoo, 20% increase. Okay? Look at the difference. If things go badly for you, there's an indefiniteness rejection, you're at 50%. If things go well for you, at least one claim is identified as allowable subject matter, 90%. That is a change of 40%. That's almost doubles, right? Finding allowable subject matter is almost double the chance of allowance as getting an indefiniteness rejection. It's 180% based on the indefinite probability. Almost double, almost twice as much. All right? So that emphasizes the importance of doing a good job on the original claims, okay? Or else you may get an indefiniteness rejection and have problems. Okay, now let's talk about rejections based on 102 and 103. 35 USC 102 is anticipation based on one reference, and 35 USC 103 is obviousness rejections based on 2 references or more than 2 references. Now, I thought that rejections based on 103 using 2 or more references, obviousness rejections, would be easier to overcome than rejections based on just 1 reference. So I thought 102 anticipation rejections would be stronger than 103 rejections. And that's true. 102 anticipation rejections, look at number 4 here, are 70% allowance rate. And 103, look at number 6, is 80% allowance rate. So that's what I thought. But there's something strange happening which I did not anticipate. Look at rejections based on a combination of 102 and 103, meaning some claims were rejected under 102 anticipation and some claims were rejected based on 103 for obviousness. Now I thought that allowance rate would fall in the middle of the 102 and 103, but it didn't. Look, it's just amazing. %. The lowest allowance rate, 60%, occurs when there's a rejection on 102 and a different rejection under 103. So let's call it a hybrid rejection, or mixed rejections. That's better. Mixed rejections, 102 and 103. I have no idea. I have no idea why this happens. It's very surprising to me. And the data sizes, the data set sizes on these are reasonable. This looks real. I don't know. But we do know this. We do know that a rejection based on 103, only 103 rejections, only obviousness rejections, those are the easiest to overcome. That's clear, 80%. So that was that I thought about that, and that's what I expected. This mixed rejection result is very surprising to me. I have to think about that. All right, we're going to continue. But the point is this, especially with the indefiniteness. An indefiniteness rejection on a first office action is the kiss of death. It's a very bad thing. It drops your expectation of allowance from 70% down to 50%, okay? So you want your original claims to be definite. All right, let's consider the AFCP, After Final Consideration Pilot Program. During speech 3, we did a very small set of 10 applications. We found 2 allowances out of 4 responses with AFCP equals 50%. That's very surprisingly high in comparison to the Qualcomm paper that we discussed with 20% allowance rate. Now, with this batch of 50, we have a larger sample. We found, in these 50 applications, we found 17 responses after final. During the second response, I'm only considering the second responses that are after final. There were a few more third responses which were also after final. I'm not considering those. Anyway, 17 response number 2s after finals. Of those, 4 were allowed, and which gives 33%. Now that's, notice the brown, because that's almost identical with the 30% that the Patent Office finds in general. So we're doing this about average, to make a long story short. We're using AFCP's After Final Consideration Pilot Program with about an average success rate. I think we can do much better if we use the 1 hour rule. Now recall that the U.S. Patent Office says 4 hours for an AFCP. If the examiner can process an AFCP in 4 hours or less, then he should do it. But as I said in my speech about AFCPs, I think speech 3, that for many reasons, the examiner really uses a 1 hour rule. Therefore, he will not search new features. Okay? He won't do it. So consider a 1 hour rule. If you think the examiner can process the amendment in 1 hour and not search any new features, then he will probably enter the amendment and process your AFCP and give you either an allowance or an office action without having to file the RCE. So the Patent Office says 4 hours, and that's what they tell the examiners. But I'm telling you, the examiners do not follow that. So is the Patent Office lying? Well, not exactly. But they're telling you their rule, but I'm telling you their rule is not followed. So I'm not sure what to call that. But it helps you to remember it as a lie. Okay? Don't listen to them. Listen to me in this case. The examiners are using 1 hour. Okay. We can analyze the success of the 4 notice of allowances that occurred out of the 12 responses with AFCP. 3 of these in black are really very, very, very minor things. The 4th one surprised me because the amendment included a feature that was discussed in an interview, but to me it looks like a substantial amendment. So that one surprised me. But nonetheless, I think that we could have a goal of 60% success rate with our AFCPs, which is, of course, is greater than 30%, if we use the 1 hour rule. We could provide additional analysis of the responses with the AFCP that were not allowed and not entered. But basically, the 1 hour rule is substantially confirmed by my analysis. So again, this is lie number 2. Patent Office says 4 hour rule, but I tell you it's a 1 hour rule. Interviews. As we previously discussed, the Patent Office loves interviews. They say interviews often help to advance prosecution and identify patentable subject matter. Now, that is a lie, okay? They say often. It really should be occasionally help or rarely help. But they say often help because to the Patent Office, an interview is a very low-cost thing. It only costs them 1 hour of examiner time. Let's call it $100. Maybe $200, but let's just say $100. So man yen. It only costs the Patent Office man yen for an interview, but it costs an applicant perhaps $1,000, right? So the Patent Office is always searching for ways to avoid office actions. And one way is interviews. So if interviews work occasionally, if they occasionally help, then the Patent Office says, yes, yes, yes. The Patent Office is desperate, trying to find ways to avoid office actions and to avoid RCEs. They want the application to be terminated as quickly as possible, either by allowance or by abandonment. And they believe that the interviews help. Interviews accelerate this. There is data that shows that sometimes it does not. We'll look. Okay, so local counsel A says, we believe that interviews reduce the number of office actions. We believe. Well, they believe. Do they really believe? Do they want to believe? Do they think? Have they ever made an experimental analysis? Probably not. Most patent attorneys are attorneys, and they believe that they can persuade people by talking. And they believe that they can persuade the examiner by being nice and polite to do the things that they want. But I tell you, examiners are not stupid. Examiners are not easily persuaded. And I have experimental data to back this up. Now, reporting letters from local counsel about the interview are always very happy. It went wonderful. The interview was very successful. The interview learned many things. Now, have you ever read a letter from local counsel about an interview that said, the interview went badly? No. I never have. I've never written one like that either. Have you ever read a letter from the local counsel that said, client, applicant, you really wasted your money. Having this interview was a stupid idea? No, I've never read a letter like that. So, as I said in one of my previous speeches, reporting letters always talk about the glass is half full. They talk about the water in the glass, never about the glass is half empty, the emptiness. The examiner, in his interview summary, often talks about the glass is half empty. Agreement was not reached, for example. All right. So now we're going to get into the data a little bit. Let's talk about early interviews. There are reasons why I separated early interviews from late interviews. As you recall from one of my speeches, I believe that many issues are not ripe. They're not ready until after the second office action. In particular, let's say the examiner makes a rejection, and I disagree with him. Well, I don't want to call him up. In fact, the Patent Office is not designed for telephone calls. It's designed for written communication for many reasons. So after I write a response, if the examiner disagrees with me, well, now the issue is ripe. The examiner has put something in writing, I put my response in writing, and the examiner disagrees with my written response. And he provides a second office action saying that he is not persuaded. He disagrees with my written response. Okay, now might be a good time for a phone interview, right? Might be, I'm not saying it is, but now it's possible. Now the issue is ripe, like an apple. Before that time, the apple is green, it's hard, it doesn't taste good. But now after the second office action, the apple might be ripe. Anyway, that's why I make my cutoff for my analysis before and after the second office action. Continuing, there were 40 total interviews. There were 20 applications with an applicant-initiated interview before the second office action. Now, it's kind of interesting because these 20 applications had a total of 24 interviews over the whole life, including after the second office action. Now, these 20 applications also had 21 interviews because one of these applications had 2 interviews before the second office action. So let's consider these applications. The 20 applications that I said had interviews before the second office action, that's the first line here. 36 office actions. So 36 divided by 20 applications equals 1.8 office actions per application. Okay. Overall, there were 94 office actions divided by the 50 applications, which is 1.88, which, by the way, approximately equals the 1.9 that the Patent Office says is average for office actions per application. Now let's consider the applications that did not have an interview before the second office action. We can find these numbers by subtraction. And 58 office actions divided by 30 applications equals 1.93. So what do we conclude from this? Well, there's 2 possibilities. The first is we can conclude that 1.80, 1.88, 1.93 are all approximately the same, that there's no statistical difference. Okay? I think that's the most likely. These are not large numbers. It's not a very large data set. So I think there's really no change. And there's another experiment data set which we will discuss later which says that there's no difference. But the other possibility, interpretation, is that there's a small difference, right? From 1.80 to 1.93. So we could conclude, and it's a reasonable conclusion, but I think it's within the margin of error, we could conclude that having an interview before the second office action results in less office actions, okay? It accelerates prosecution. In fact, it accelerates prosecution using these numbers by, the difference is 0.13, right? 1.80 minus 1.93 equals 0.13 times 20 applications equals negative 2.6. So doing this, having an interview, gives you negative 2.6 office actions. It reduces the number of office actions that you would expect by 2.6. Well, that's nice. We all enjoy having less office actions. But notice, we spent 24 interviews. These 20 cases consumed 24 interviews to save us 2.6 office actions. So 24 interviews to save 2.6 office actions. Approximately 10 interviews for 1 office action. Okay? Statistically, I don't think it's significant, but even if we assume that it is, it's a very, very small benefit. 10 to 1. 10 interviews might reduce the number of office actions by 1. In other words, an interview has a 10% chance of causing 1 less office action. This is not very effective, right? Interviews are expensive. And interviews double the chance of an extension of time from 15% to 30%. So an interview costs perhaps $1,000. So continuing, what about the allowance rate? What about the allowance rate? Do these interviews cause us to have an increased allowance rate similar to, for example, finding a allowable subject matter? The answer is no. In fact, the allowance rate is 70%, 14 out of 20, which is almost exactly 68%. So, no, I would say no. You could argue it's a tiny advantage, right? But it's not significant. So, truth is, interviews before the second office action have no value, right? According to this experimental data. They do not reduce the number of office actions, or if they do, by only a tiny amount, and they do not increase the allowance rate by any statistically relevant amount. Think about that. It's very interesting, right? Because the patent office has been telling you interviews are wonderful. The local council has been telling you every time they report an office action, interviews are wonderful. And every time there's a reporting letter about the interview, the reporting letter says, this interview was wonderful. But the data says, no. The data says the interviews accomplish nothing. Or maybe just a tiny bit, maybe. Maybe 10 interviews reduce one office action, maybe. Okay, what about late interviews? What about interviews after the second office action? You would think that these would be wonderful things because now the issues may be ripe, as I discussed before. Well, we have 12 of these, 12 applications with late interviews, and of these, 8 were allowed, which is a 69% allowance rate, which is, let's face it, that's 68%. That's the same. There's no change. Now, what's interesting is that these 12 applications actually had 19 interviews. So there was about 1.5 interviews per application for these 12 applications. Some of these, so clearly some of these had multiple interviews, right? In fact, one of them had 5 interviews. 5 interviews. So let's reach some conclusions about our experimental data based on 50 applications for this applicant, okay? Early interviews, meaning before the second office action, do not affect the allowance rate and do not affect the number of office actions, okay? Or maybe a very, very slight effect, 10 to 1, 10 interviews, 1 office action. And late interviews do not affect the allowance rate. I did not measure the number of office actions regarding late interviews, so ran out of time. But we see that interviews are generally ineffective based on this data set. Ineffective. What about the literature? Well, what do other people have to say about this issue, interviews? It's a very important issue to me. And I found an article by Dr. K. Pham at Baranto and Pham, 2015. And Dr. Pham recommends, and I'm going to quote now, he recommends interviews preferably early during the prosecution history before the final office action. Okay? He recommends interviews, especially early interviews. He loves early interviews. Now, Dr. Pham also says, oh, here's some interesting statistics, by the way. And he mentions this link. He provides this link to Patentlio. Now, Patentlio is a website run by Mr. Dennis Crouch, Professor Dennis Crouch from University of Missouri. And Professor Dennis Crouch did a sample of 17,000 applications, okay? 17,000. That's a nice big number. During the years 2000 to 2005. Now, 18% of these applications were associated with an examiner interview. 18%. Notice, we had 40 interviews in 50 applications. 80% of our, let's say 80% of our applications, if the interviews were distributed, 1 per application, 80% of our applications have interviews. But most people, most applicants don't do this. Only 20% of applications, or 18%, have interviews. So we're doing something very, 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 very different. We're having much this applicant, has much larger number of interviews, 4 times as many interviews. Oh, let's make this clear. 18% is approximately 1 out of 5, okay? The general public, everybody, is having 1 interview out of 5 applications. Approximately 18%, 20% is 1 out of 5, all right? This applicant is having 4 out of 5. 4 out of 5 applications have an interview, okay? Look at that difference. Why? Why is this applicant having 4 interviews out of 5 when the general public is only doing 1? What's going on? I don't know. Okay, what else does Mr. Crouch find? Professor Crouch. What else does Professor Crouch find? Early interviews before the final office action had the same grant rate as those that did not. No effect on allowance, okay? The same grant rate. That's the same thing we found, right? No difference. The same allowance rate, about 70%. However, here's where it gets very interesting. However, those with an interview tended to stay pending longer and be more likely to have an RCE in the file history. Interesting, right? So not only did these cases with interviews have no increased allowance rate, no improved allowance rate, but additionally they had more RCEs and probably more office actions. Now, I suspect that the reason for this is that these interviews tended to occur in the more difficult cases. So the more difficult cases tended to have more office actions before a result could be determined, either abandonment or allowance. Now, what about interviews, late interviews after the final office action? Well, interviews after final had a much higher grant rate than applications with final office actions but no interview. So 74% with interview versus 60% without interview. So Professor Crouch finds that the late interviews were very effective. But I want to consider, these late interviews are very different than the late interviews in our experiment. Because these late interviews only occurred approximately, well, consider this, 20% of these applications had interviews, and roughly, let's say, 10% of them, half of them had early interviews and half of them had late interviews. So these late interviews are only occurring in 1 out of 10 applications. So I think they're occurring when there's a good opportunity, when there's a ripe issue, okay? So they're effective, but this does show something. Interviews, I believe, can be very effective under certain conditions. Number one, the issue is ripe, okay? In particular, it should be after the second office action. Now, Professor Crouch is using final office action, not second office action as his cutoff, but there's reasons for that, but it's close, very similar. So, to summarize, Professor Crouch finds interviews before final office action are a bad idea. They accomplish nothing good and they accomplish some evil, right? Allowance rate the same, but number of RCEs increases. That's a bad thing. On the other hand, Professor Crouch finds interviews after the final office action have a good effect, right? Again, I think these are carefully considered interviews. They're not just, for example, I don't think these interviews are, for example, to discuss a feature that has not yet been examined, to discuss a new feature. I don't think so. In any case, we see there is some evidence for a positive effect from interviews when it's after the final office action, late interviews. So there's some experimental data, not my experimental data, but Professor Crouch's experimental data that under some conditions there are good results from interviews after the final office action. Now, our data didn't show this, but it's reasonable. What else? Okay, let's continue. So the Patent Office, I believe, tells us 3 lies, or 3 things they believe, but we have to be very careful with. Restrictions. They say the number of claims does not matter. Well, that's just a lie. The number of claims is very, very important, okay? We have strong statistical evidence for that. Now, the second lie or misleading statement is regarding AFCPs. They say there's a 4-hour rule for entering the amendment. If it can be entered in less than 4 hours, the examiner should do it. And I tell you, the examiners are not doing that. Now, I don't have evidence of this, but trust me, I know. I was an examiner for 4 years. I know what they think. I know what's going on with these things. The examiners use a 1-hour rule. If they can't enter the amendment and process it, write an office action or allow it in less than 1 hour, they're not going to do it. Okay, there are production issues. It's complicated. Let's continue. The third thing, the Patent Office says interviews often help. Often help. Good idea. It's often a good idea. And we just found no. Okay, our analysis of 50 said either it doesn't help or it helps only a tiny bit. 10 interviews for 1 reduced office action, okay? That's very expensive, and it's probably not statistically relevant. Professor Crouch, using a much larger sample size, but a sample size having a very low number of interviews per application average, okay? So it really is a different sample. It's a different beast. Anyway, Professor Crouch finds 2 things. 1, interviews before final office action accomplish nothing regarding allowance rate and cause additional RCEs. So they really have negative value. Professor Crouch finds that interviews after the final office action have increased allowance rates, substantially increased allowance rate. I've written Professor Crouch a letter requesting more information about this, about his large sample, and we'll see if I can get some more information. If I do, maybe I will update this video. Conclusions. Okay, well, we have the restrictions. 216 rule gives you 10% restriction rate, which is less than the 20% rate, so that's a good thing. 216 rule. Indefiniteness in the first office action at 28%, which is 7 out of 14, 50% chance of allowance, okay? Which is very, very, very bad. You don't want indefiniteness. Allowable subject matter, there were 16% in the first office action, so it's, and 7 of those 8 were allowed, which is about 90%. So again, indefiniteness, very, very bad. Allowable subject matter, very, very good, which is what you would expect. Although I have to say, the bad effect of the indefiniteness is stronger than anticipated. It's remarkable. Okay, AFCP, we found 4 notice of allowances out of our 12 cases, and 33%, which is about an average of 30%. I believe that we can double this using the 1-hour rule. Early interviews, 14 out of 20, 70%. Late interviews, 8 out of 12, 69%. Pretty much almost exactly 68%, right? Surprisingly close to 68%, considering the, well, relatively small number of database, right? 14 out of 20, 8 out of 12. I mean, this is exactly 70%. This is amazingly close, surprisingly close. Okay, 40 out of 50 applications had interviews. This applicant is doing 0.8 interviews per application. This is much, much, much more than the 0.2 interviews per application that Professor Crouch measured in his large sample. Okay, 4 times as large. This, you see this? I mean, it really jumps out, right? 0.8 interviews per application versus 0.2. This applicant is doing something extremely unusual, which is why I started studying this issue. Okay, back to the chocolate rules. Let's go over them one more time just so you remember them. And the first rule is good titles are good. Second rule, interviews are bad unless they're late, meaning after the second office action, and there's no new feature. Don't have an interview to discuss a new feature not yet examined. Now, Professor Crouch's definition of late is after the final office action. That's fine. You can use that definition if you wish. I believe that after the second office action instead of after the final office action is a little bit more useful for theoretical reasons. AFCP equals 1 hour with no new feature. Okay? If your amendment will take the examiner less than 1 hour to process, then he will enter the amendment and give you an allowance or an office action. Number 4, help the examiner to help you. Okay? Give him a good title, give him a good parts list, give him some other things that I will discuss in later speeches. If you help the examiner, he will help you. In fact, he may give you a first action allowance. Okay? That's what we want. We want an allowance, and we want it now. Right now. We want an allowance to our application in the first office action. It's a beautiful thing. Okay? It's a beautiful thing. You file an application, the examiner says, good job, here's your notice of allowance, give us a few dollars and we'll issue your patent. It's wonderful. All right, 216 reduces restrictions. Indefinite is bad. Allowable subject matter is good. I think I might change this. Indefinite is very bad and allowable subject matter is very good. Number 7, the patent office lies. They're lying to you. There's just no way around it. So don't believe everything the patent office says. Okay, what else do we have? The end. Chocolate with Ed Garcia. More gold mining. This was the best speech ever. I say, the best speech ever. Yes, it was the best speech ever. As always, we're going to end with a picture of a wood carving print of Mount Fuji. There's Mount Fuji. And here's some guys fishing. Here's someone looking at Mount Fuji. And here's the horse. What is the horse looking at? Well, let's zoom in. What is that? I think that is a cat. I think that is a cat reaching up with its left front paw and grabbing this rope. And here's the tail. And here are the back feet. I think that is a cat, but I'm not sure. Does anyone know? This is very interesting, right? Something is happening here. The horse is looking down. Yeah, I don't know what's going on. It's very interesting though. Senju in the Musashi province. And Bushu Senju. Wonderful. Arigatou gozaimasu. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.